Hello. So I'm recording this short lecture just to talk about some of the kinds of core tropes and themes that we're engaging with in class. And in particular, I want to talk about the vanishing Indian trope, which maybe some of you have heard of, but maybe not. So I just wanted to make sure we're all on the same page. And so as you're reading the various pieces for the readings today, the kind of core points, right, is that there's this entire system of mass media cultural production that represents indigenous Native American peoples, right? From movies to anthropologists and researchers to games, to any number of books, any number of things, right? That create this image of what it is to be Native American within the broad public imagination. And the thing is that that representation or that image of what it means to be Native American is often very much divorced from actual Native American people's lives in a very radical way. Now, these representations tend to depict indigenous peoples as part of a prehistorical past, as part of an unchanging past, and opposed to civilization or modernity. There is this sense that they are opposed to they aren't around anymore, right? This past tensing, framing of Native American peoples in the past tense. And you see that assumption over and over again. And so what we see, right, is within this kind of system of cultural production that I'm talking about, actual Native American peoples have very little power over these representations, which are overwhelmingly controlled by settlers. At the same time, indigenous peoples have to actually navigate the real social and political effects of these representations, even when they claim the power to represent themselves. So for example, Tom King says he wants to create a book of photographs to represent Native American peoples in their complexity as a kind of alternative to the project of Edward Curtison. And then the problem that he faces, right, is if he wants to represent Native American peoples as, for example, moderns, then the problem is that how does he represent them in a way that's still recognizable to outside viewers as Native American people? How do you represent Native American peoples in a way that is recognizable as Native American? And that poses a challenge to him. On the other hand, we can also look at this work of representing Native American peoples as appropriating indigeneity, or what Philip Deloria talks about as playing Indian, is actually a really important part of settler colonial identity. It's an important part of how settlers construct their own sense of belonging and community. Yeah, I think that's, so that's a little more complicated, right? But the idea is that there's something about settler colonialism that involves not just the elimination and erasure and genocide of indigenous peoples in order to appropriate landscapes, but also the appropriation of indigeneity so that settlers become almost native themselves in order to kind of claim belonging within these landscapes in order to cultivate a kind of sense of what it means to be American, as opposed to what it means to be English. And of course, we see this, as Philip Deloria points out in the handout, which you may or may not have read, we see this even with the, what am I looking for? The dumping of tea into the Boston Harbor, the Boston Tea Party. We see people donning up these images, this paraphernalia of Indianness in order to represent themselves as exterior to England and opposed to England. And in playing Indian in this way, construct their own sense of who they are as an American people. We see this, for example, in what's the word I'm looking for? In the construction of state parks in the early 1900s. One of the big motivators for constructing state parks in North America and the United States was this idea that real American men needed to encounter the wilderness. And that was what made them real American men, in a way that was different, for example, than Europe. And part of this idea of encountering the wilderness was very much an idea, for example, joining the Boy Scouts, learning these Indian traditions, quote unquote, um, and playing Indian in order to, again, craft this sense of identity of being specifically uniquely American as the inheritors of indigeneity within this landscape. It's complicated, right? So I want to kind of, to illustrate this, I was doing this kind of experiment. I just started Googling Native American. No, I Googled Indians first. What happens if you Google search images for Indians? You see mostly sports teams and occasionally a historic photo, painting marked very generically Plains Indian. So this is a Plains Indian. There is no name to this person who is represented here, just a generic Indian, right? Tom King talks about this. And so mostly you see sports teams, and occasionally you see people dressed up in what we might consider stereotypical Native American garb. Now, this is specifically Plains garb. The association between Indian and Plains garb, like this, the headdress, for example, the buckskin, it has to do with Westerns, right? This comes out of Westerns in which the idea was actually representing Plains people, and then they get conflated with Native American as a whole. So what happens if we search Native Americans? So this is a little better, right? We don't get the sports team mascots, but we get a lot of historic photos. Again, this idea being that Native American, illustrating this idea that Native American peoples belong to a prehistorical past. They belong to an American prehistory, not an American present. There are occasional photos of people done up in regalia, and again, in this way that fits this kind of stereotypical representation of Native American, right? In a way in that actually a lot of indigenous folks do dress up this way, whether for ceremony or because they are seeking to do something and they want to be recognized as Native American. For example, there are examples of social movements, right, where indigenous activists dress up in regalia and canoe to a site as part of a protest or ride in on horses. And the idea is they want settlers to immediately look at them and say, that is a Native American person. They are doing something Native American. Just like Tom King, they want to be legible. They want to be recognizable as Native American to a broader populace who is familiar largely with, for example, Hollywood stereotypes. Now, we do also get a few photos of contemporary Native American peoples. Fortunately, we have a couple indigenous people in Congress that have created now. I saw 2 photos in that first set of photos, right? In that search, right? 2 sets of 2 photos that were contemporary Native American peoples being contemporary folks wearing regular, that's already a little odd of a phrasing, but wearing, like standard, I'm doing it again, but, wearing clothes that we would gloss as modern and not like quote unquote stereotypically Indian, right? Folks wearing jeans and t-shirts, which is how most Native American folks will dress on a day-to-day basis, right? Because they fucking shop at Walmart or Target or wherever. Or I don't know where people shop, Macy's. If you have a lot of money to spend and need to look a little nicer. Native Americans, what happens? So then I'm like, okay, so what happens if we look up white people? I thought this was really funny because you search white people and you get Donald Trump and a lot of black people. I don't know what's up with there. I looked up settler colonists. And again, you get a bunch of historical photos and paintings. The idea being that settler colonialism is something that happened a long time ago. Oh, and then you get the MAGA hat kid. That's golden. But overwhelmingly, other than the MAGA cat cave, you get this idea that settler colonialism is part of this historical event that happened a long time ago, not something that continues to structure our lives, right? In the way that I talk about myself as a settler, or we will be talking about today, the cultivation or construction of settler identities through things like sports teams mascots. I think if you look up settlers, you get the same thing. Oh, you get Settlers of Catan. Very nice. Or maybe that's not what this is. This might be a video game. Okay, so again, this is all just to illustrate this idea that mainstream representations of indigenous peoples represent them as belonging to a kind of past that or a prehistory of America as no longer existing today. And we see this with this phenomenon that Ojibwe scholar Jean O'Brien talks about as lasting. For example, here's a kind of canonical example is the movie The Last of the Mohicans. Now, Mohican people are still around today. There was no last one of them. And of course, the movie is set in like the 1800s or something. Again, it's totally fictional, the idea that there is a last of the Mohicans. And this is a trope you see a lot. For example, you have like the last California Indian, which was Ishi, who is this fellow who was put in a kind of museum in this really tragic story after his family was killed. But there's this whole narrative of being the last Indian. And in a lot of movies, the last Indian ends up being a white person, like in Last of Mohicans, also like in Avatar, the CGI movie, Not the Last Airbender. And this is, again, part of what Philip Deloria talks about as playing Indian, which you'll see in the handout for today if you haven't read that already. The link to the handout is in the discussion forums. But they get this idea, right, that the last of the Mohicans is actually a settler, plays into this idea that settlers become the inheritors of indigeneity. They become the inheritors of the landscape. And that is important. That's an important piece of what makes them uniquely American as opposed to European. One of the tropes we see over and over again is this idea of the noble savage. So if you have, for example, the savage who is, for example, fighting wars against the cowboys in cowboy Indian movies and Westerns, the noble savage is romantic. This is an idea that comes out of the Romantic literary movement in, I believe, the 1900s. The idea here is that Native American peoples represent being closer to nature, usually having magical abilities or knowledge like Pocahontas with her colors of the wind, the ability to speak to animals or something like that. But the idea being the noble savage is not corrupted by civilization. They are pre-modern and uncorrupted and more pure. And the romantic move is that the noble savage is someone who's really desirable, but again, ultimately disappearing, ultimately dying off in the wake of modern society. So whether these stereotypes are representing indigenous peoples as dangerous enemies or noble savages who are connected to nature in a way that are alienating, quote unquote, are alienating modern society is ripping away from us, these are still like, this is the kind of overall logic of these stereotypes. So the vanishing Indian, right, is a trope that refers to this process by which Indians, Native American folks, are said to be disappearing. They're said to be, disappearing, becoming a part of the past and not no longer a part of a present. And so this is a famous painting, right, that was painted in 1872 called American Progress. And it represents this idea of the vanishing Indian. This is Lady Progress here, who is coming from the side of light. You have train tracks, a train representing industry, which is being preceded by caravans of settlers pushing out west, farming the land, A lot of indigenous peoples did farm, but one of the things that colonial ideologies said, especially in this time, was that they weren't farming. For example, war against the Navajo Nation in the late 1800s was largely justified by the idea that they weren't making good use of the landscape, that they were savages who didn't know how to work the land. Part of how that ideology was materialized was by the army actually burning Navajo agricultural fields. So they no longer existed, right? So this is the kind of progress pushing forward. And in the corner, you have this darkness that's being pushed away by the light, by literally the Enlightenment. And you have Native American folks with bows and arrows who are running, seeking refuge along with the buffalo from this kind of forward march of American progress. Native American folks are fighting with they're using bows and arrows here, which is certainly a thing that people did, but by this point, guns were pretty well widespread, you know, like Europeans show up and trade happens and guns pour through indigenous communities, right? Like most indigenous military forces are fighting with guns. You know, several centuries before the 1800s. Anyway, so we see this idea of the vanishing Indian trope. Native Americans are vanishing due to this forward march of progress. So that's what the vanishing Indian trope is about. Again, maybe that is something that you already are familiar with, maybe not. But this is an important stereotypical representation that is within the United States. This idea that Native American peoples belong to the past and not the present, and certainly not the future. That the future belongs to the settler moderns, and that the Indians all disappeared, or at least the real Indians all disappeared in the face of civilization and modernity. All right, so go to, for the next section of this assignment, go to Canvas and go to the class page, and you'll fill out the discussion. You'll instead of having a Zoom-based class this Wednesday, you go to discussions, or you can do this through modules. Here's a form where you can ask me questions if you need clarification on anything, but otherwise have a discussion among yourselves. This is the handout that I mentioned. You can link here. I've given you some prompts if you need structure. If there's something you want to talk about, go for it. These prompts is just suggestions. If there's another area you want to go deeper into, go for it. You should post at least one post and then also respond to 2 of your peers. But the idea here is to have a conversation over the form, this online form, as an alternative to the Zoom class. All right, I'll see you guys on Monday. Bye.